There is a version of Pierce Brosnan the world knows well. The man with the easy smile, the sharp suit, and the kind of charm that made women fall in love and men want to be him. He was smooth on camera and gracious off it. He shook hands with stagehands and remembered the names of people other stars would never notice. For decades, that was the image, polished, warm, unshakable. But behind that image lived another man entirely. A man who had buried his wife. A man who had watched his children fall apart. A man who had been fired from the greatest role of his life in a 47-second phone call, alone, on a beach in the Bahamas, with no warning and no dignity. A man who had smiled through losses that would have broken most people, and who had kept quiet about things that would have destroyed reputations if he had spoken them out loud. Today, the silence ends. Because Pierce Brosnan, gentleman icon 007, has 5 names burned into his memory. Not fans. Not critics. 5 people from inside his own world who left marks he could never fully forget. Some took things from him. Some betrayed him. One nearly cost him everything he had left. These are not rumors. This is the story behind the man the cameras never truly captured. The first name on that list might shock you the most, because it belongs to someone Pierce once called a friend. Timothy Dalton was not Pierce Brosnan's enemy. That is exactly what made everything so painful. In another life, in a fairer world, the two men might have laughed about it over drinks years later. But the wound that Timothy Dalton left on Pierce Brosnan was not carved with cruelty. It was carved with timing, and sometimes that hurts even more. By the mid-1980s, Pierce Brosnan was on the edge of something extraordinary. Bond producer Albert Cubby Broccoli had personally handpicked him. Even Cassandra Harris, Pierce's wife at the time, who had appeared in a Bond film herself, was certain it was only a matter of time. The role felt promised. It felt real. Even Ian Fleming's widow had said Pierce was exactly the kind of man her late husband had imagined when he created 007. Everything pointed in one direction. Then the ground shifted beneath his feet. Brosnan was starring in the TV show Remington Steele. When the show was canceled in 1986, it looked like the timing was finally right. Bond was calling. But the moment the Bond rumors started spreading, NBC smelled an opportunity. They reversed the cancellation and ordered new episodes. Because of his contract, Pierce had no choice. He had to say no to Bond, the role he had been dreaming of, the role his wife believed he was born to play. And the man who stepped in? Timothy Dalton. A good man. A talented actor. Someone Pierce had shared laughs with in the industry. That made it almost impossible to process. There was no villain to be angry at. No betrayal to point to. Just a friend, standing in the spot that was supposed to be Pierce's, wearing the tuxedo that was supposed to be Pierce's, living the life that was supposed to be Pierce's. I had to smile through it, Brosnan once said. That sentence says everything. While Pierce was smiling for cameras, his wife Cassandra was quietly losing her battle with ovarian cancer. The dream of Bond had been her dream too. She believed in him before the producers did, before the critics did, before anyone did. And now, as her health declined, Pierce watched a close friend claim the very thing she had always told him was his destiny. Dalton's Bond was serious and gritty. The Living Daylights performed well internationally, but License to Kill underperformed in America, earning just $34 million domestically. Some fans quietly said what everyone was thinking, that something was missing. That spark. That particular warmth and wit that Pierce carried naturally. Industry insiders would later whisper that Dalton was never meant to be permanent, that the seat had always been kept warm. But none of that knowledge made it easier to live through. Pierce kept working through what fans now call the lost years, from 1986 to 1994, taking other roles, staying visible, staying ready, and carrying a grief that mixed personal and professional pain until the two were impossible to separate. When Dalton finally stepped away in 1994 and the call came through for Pierce, the victory was real. GoldenEye became a phenomenon, earning over $350 million worldwide and reminding the world what Bond was supposed to feel like. But scars do not disappear just because the wound eventually heals. Pierce never said a bitter word about Dalton in public. The people close to him, though, always understood the history. Timothy Dalton was never the enemy. He was something harder to forgive, a symbol, a closed door, a dream deferred by a cruel twist of fate, and a television network's last-minute greed. But losing Bond to a friend was only the beginning. What came next hit Pierce somewhere far deeper, inside his own family. Christopher Brosnan was not Pierce's biological son. But to Pierce, that distinction meant absolutely nothing. When Pierce married Cassandra Harris in 1980, he inherited two stepchildren, Charlotte and Christopher. When their biological father, actor Dermot Harris, died in 1986, Pierce legally adopted them both. He gave them his name. More importantly, he gave them everything he had never received himself as a boy: stability, presence, a father who actually stayed. Pierce had grown up without his own father. He was shuffled between relatives, left to figure out the world largely on his own. That childhood shaped him in ways that never fully left. So when Christopher and Charlotte came into his life, it was not just an act of love. It was a personal mission. He was determined to be the father he had never had. For years, it worked. The family was close. Pierce once described the feeling of that family unit as something that grounded him completely. Christopher was bright and energetic. He even worked behind the scenes on some of Pierce's Bond films, Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough. There were real signs of a life being built. Then Cassandra died. It was 1991. She had fought ovarian cancer for 4 brutal years, and when she finally lost the fight, the family shattered. Christopher was only 19 years old. He had lost his mother and the anchor of his entire emotional world in a single moment. While Pierce buried himself in work and in caring for the children, Christopher began to quietly spiral in ways that were hard to see at first. The drinking came early. In 1996, a fine for drunk driving. The following year, an arrest and 3 months in prison for repeating the offense. Pierce covered legal costs. He extended every olive branch he could find. But something deeper had broken in Christopher. Something that a father's love, no matter how genuine, could not reach. The substance abuse followed. Christopher fell deep into addiction, eventually collapsing outside a London nightclub and falling into a coma. In 2012, at 32 years old, he was arrested again for hard drug possession. The tabloids were merciless, splashing his last name across headlines as though his identity began and ended with whose son he was. To Pierce, watching from the outside, it was a living nightmare. Another person he loved disappearing before his eyes, just as Cassandra had disappeared, and just as helpless to stop it. "I hate what this world did to him," Pierce once confided to a close friend. "I hate that I couldn't stop it." By 2024, Christopher had been largely absent from public life for nearly 2 decades. When paparazzi found him outside a grocery store in London, gaunt, alone, looking far older than his 51 years, the photos hit like a gut punch for anyone who remembered that smiling boy standing beside Pierce on red carpets. Pierce never publicly condemned him. He never aired the pain. But those who knew him said he quietly checked in through mutual friends, sending help through back channels, never fully letting go even when letting go might have been easier. Pierce had buried Cassandra. In 2013, he buried Charlotte, his adopted daughter, who died from the same ovarian cancer that had taken her mother. To then watch Christopher consumed by addiction was a third loss in a trilogy of grief. 3 people he had loved completely. 3 losses he had been powerless to prevent. The world had only ever seen Pierce Brosnan smiling. It never saw the weight he carried home every night. If the losses inside his family were the wounds that never stopped bleeding, then what Daniel Craig represented was something different, a betrayal that came dressed in a business suit and delivered with corporate coldness. When Pierce Brosnan filmed Die Another Day in 2002, nobody told him it would be his last Bond film. That is the part that still burns. He was in the best shape of his career. He was pitching ideas for Bond 21. He was planning the next chapter. The film itself became the highest-grossing Bond movie in history at that point, earning $431 million worldwide. By every measurable standard, Pierce Brosnan was at the top. Then, on a quiet afternoon in the Bahamas in 2004, a phone rang. The voice on the other end did not even belong to a producer. It was a middleman. The message was delivered in 47 seconds. You were a great James Bond. Thank you very much. Goodbye. No meeting. No farewell dinner. No handshake. No acknowledgement of 4 films, nearly a decade of loyalty, or a franchise he had helped pull back from collapse. Just 47 seconds, and it was over. What Pierce would later discover made it worse. Behind the scenes, the studio had been screen testing replacements for 2 full years while he was still actively in the role. He had been carrying the franchise forward in public while being quietly phased out in private. The decision had been made long before that phone call. The call was just the formality. Daniel Craig became the new Bond. Pierce did not hate Craig personally. He barely knew him. But Craig became the symbol of everything that had been taken from Pierce without ceremony, without grace, and without the basic human decency of a face-to-face conversation. When Casino Royale was released and became a massive critical and commercial success, Pierce watched in complicated silence. Bond had survived. It had just survived without him. And without even a quiet thank you for keeping it alive through the 90s when nobody else could. His asking price dropped from $12 million per film to $3 million. He let go of 12 members of his personal team. Projects dried up. His children saw him cry for the first time. He was just crushed, said a close friend. He had given everything to Bond. And then he was just erased. It was not just a firing. It was an erasure. And the unnamed executive who ordered that 47-second phone call, who deliberately timed it while Pierce was isolated and alone, became the 5th and perhaps most quietly despised figure in Pierce Brosnan's story. A faceless corporate decision-maker who saw an icon and calculated only the cost. Who ended an era not with applause, but with a dial tone. Pierce has rebuilt. The Matador showed dramatic range no Bond film ever required of him. The Ghost Rider reminded critics who he actually was. Black Adam brought him a new generation of fans. He married again, Keely Shea Smith, and built a family life filled with genuine happiness. He carries himself still with that signature grace. But grace is not the same as forgiveness. And memory is not the same as bitterness. Timothy Dalton, who stood in a doorway that should have been Pierce's. Christopher, the son he could not save. Daniel Craig, who inherited a future Pierce was building. The unnamed executive, who ended everything in 47 seconds. And the A-list diva on the set of Mamma Mia, who turned what was supposed to be a joyful comeback into one of the most miserable shoots of his career, demanding trailer relocations, ordering costume changes minutes before filming, treating crew members with contempt while Pierce quietly shook hands with the gaffers and tried to hold the production together through pure professionalism. He almost walked off Mamma Mia. Here we go again, one production assistant later revealed. And for a man who had survived everything life had thrown at him, that says everything about what that experience cost him. 5 names, 5 wounds, each one different in its shape. Envy, grief, betrayal, abandonment, disrespect. But Pierce Brosnan, the man who played the world's coolest spy and cried quietly in hotel rooms nobody ever saw, carried every single one of them, without ever losing what made him worth watching in the first place. That, in the end, is the real story behind 007.